Musical musings, musical musings, musical musings, musical musings.
Hello and good afternoon. Welcome back to the latest episode of our Musical Musings program. We air this program every Wednesday at 1 p.m. and we broadcast it from Rajamachan University of Technology, Peranakan. I'll be bringing you this program in two parts. In our first part, I'm going to introduce a song to you. We will also talk about the band, the group, the performer that does the song, talk a little bit about the group and the song, what it's all about, what the song is about. Then we will go ahead and listen to the song. After that, in the second part of our program, we will go through the lyrics of the song. That means the words. The lyrics are the words of the song. And we will discuss anything that might be difficult to understand. Any sayings or difficult vocabulary words, any slang terms that we might use in the song. We'll explain what those mean for any of you who may not be familiar with some of the English. And then after that, that will be the end of our program. So we will bring you the news and the latest updates from the university, as always.
Musical musings, musical musings, musical musings, musical musings.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Gary Gray, and I will be your host for today's Musical Musings program. I'm an American teacher here in Thailand at Rajamachan University of Technology, Peranakan. I've been teaching here for about 7 years. I sometimes like to incorporate music into my teaching, and so naturally, that's why I'm interested in hosting this program for you, where we will talk about music. So for today's episode, we're going to talk about the song Daylight Again, which is by Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. All right, so first, how about that group, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young? All right, so it's a little bit of a weird group because they changed a little bit. A lot of bands actually change their members, right? We see that a lot. If you've listened to my program before, we like to talk about some older bands. So they've been around a long time. So some people come, some people go, and they change things up a little bit. This band has only sort of done that one time. But they've kind of come and gone, and so that it's been kind of weird the way they've changed it. And what I mean by that is each of these words is a name. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. It's a name of one of the band members. They first formed in 1968, and it was just Crosby, Stills, and Nash. So these are all three gentlemen, four if you include Young when he joined. So sometimes this group is known as Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And a lot of times people will just shorten it to CSN, Crosby, Stills, Nash, CSN. Sometimes it's called Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. And then they'll say CSNY. Depends who's in the band at the time. But like I said, they haven't really changed much. It's always been those three or those four. Neil Young, that's Young. His first name is Neil. Neil Young has kind of come and gone. I don't recall if we've done a song by Neil Young yet on our program. We may have. I'd have to go back and check our records. We may have done Southern Man by Neil Young. Neil Young is very interesting. He has a very unique voice, which some people would say actually isn't very good. I kind of like it. I kind of like the sound to it. It's because it's not that he's out of tune or anything. He sings in tune. He sings fine. But it's kind of a very whiny, nasal sort of sounding voice. So to some people, it doesn't sound very good. But I think the style of his songs, since a lot of them are kind of sad songs, it kind of goes along with the way he sings. and he's an excellent songwriter. In fact, I should have looked up a little bit more information about the song we're doing today, because it's actually a little hard to get a hold of because it's a combination of two songs, I think. We've got Daylight Again, but then we have something at the end called Cost of Freedom, which has been combined with other songs as well. So it's almost like these are two different songs. Uh, and I know at one point, I believe it was, I forget whether it was Nash or Stills, has kind of done this song by himself at times, but I actually think it was written by Neil Young. From the information I did find on this song, I believe it's written by Neil Young. So Neil Young is an excellent songwriter. I think we might have done him once before on this program. We might have even done Crosby, Stills, and Nash one other time. I'm trying to remember. I don't recall doing a song by them yet. But the reason I have to think about that is I do like to do songs by performers who have recently passed away, kind of in honor of them. And David Crosby, that's Crosby, David Crosby did actually pass away not too long ago. It's been a year or two now. It's been a little while, but not too long ago, maybe a year ago, something like that. So I would have thought, since I really like this band, that we would have done them by now, but I can't recall us doing any songs by Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. So we have been doing this program for almost a year now, so there may be one I'm forgetting in there. I should be keeping track so that your host doesn't repeat songs. But I don't like have a listing of all the songs we've done. But I don't believe we've done anything by these guys before. So again, they formed in 1968. They stopped performing together in about 2015, but they kind of got back together, broke up, got back together, broke up. And like I said, Neil Young came and he went and he came and he went because he had his own solo career as well. So sometimes he was out doing his own thing. Sometimes he would come back and join them. Plus, they didn't really get along, some of them. I think David Crosby is the one that really annoyed some of the other band members. And it's not that he was a bad guy. He was more into the fun of it, just enjoying himself. And some of the other guys took their music a lot more seriously. So it was like, come on, David, what are you doing? Because David was always messing around. And because of that kind of attitude that he had and what was going on in the world at that time, there was, drug use became kind of popular. So he got into drugs and things like that. And they just clashed a lot. They got into fights a lot. So they would break up and then get back together and break up and get back together. What I thought was nice is when David Crosby passed away, like I said, not too long ago, the other guys came out and all just had wonderful things to say about him. The reason I thought that was nice is because even though they'd broken up and gotten back together, broken up, gotten back together, broken up, gotten back together, they hadn't been together for almost 10 years. Because, like I said, he died fairly recently, maybe last year. So they hadn't performed together since 2015. That's 8 years. It's almost a decade they haven't been together. And it's because they didn't get along. So that shows you just how much they didn't get along. They've made some great music, dozens of fantastic songs, yet they can't even stand each other. And so for them to just come out and have nothing but nice things to say, I mean, of course, you're going to try to be nice. The guy just died. So, of course, you're going to try to be nice. But sometimes it's hard. If you really don't like someone, it's hard to come out and say nice things about them. So I think that really reflected well on the rest of the band, just as human beings. And a lot of their songs are about taking care of one another, like their song, Teach Your Children. It's about exactly what it sounds like, teaching your children well. The song we're doing today, Daylight Again, is about peace and war, but the angle they take on it is really interesting. And in fact, let's start talking about the song. So the name of the song is Daylight Again. The reason I say this is a very interesting song and the band's take on the song, like what the lyrics mean, is very interesting. So this is an anti-war peace song that came out during the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was not very popular in America. You would think it wouldn't be very popular in Southeast Asia since it was in Vietnam, and I'm sure it wasn't. But believe it or not, even though Americans were doing most of the fighting there, most Americans actually did not like the war either. So we kind of agree with you guys that that was not a very good war. So there were a lot of anti-war protests and things like that. And this band was really pretty strongly anti-war. But here's the interesting thing. During the Vietnam War, when the soldiers would come home from Vietnam, they were not treated well at all because people didn't like the war. So they kind of blamed the soldiers. Now, is that reasonable? No. We had something called the draft in America, and that is when you are forced to serve in the military. A lot of countries have that. But a country like the US, we kind of try not to do that, because Americans are so patriotic. So everyone wants to join the military, right? So our military is mostly all volunteer. But I say mostly because in times of war, the government can force people into fighting. So this is why I say it's wrong to blame the soldiers. These are not young men. There weren't really many women. We have women in the military now. There were some back then, but not many. It's mostly men. So these are young men, almost boys, because you can start as young as 18. So these are young men and boys who didn't want to go there. They're not the bad guys in this. The soldiers are not the bad guys. They should not be treated badly when they come home. A lot of them did not want to be there. And even some of them that thought they did because thought it was for a good cause. Once they got to Vietnam and saw what was going on, they changed their mind. In fact, a lot of soldiers became anti-war protesters when they got back. But there were, again, a lot of people that were treating the soldiers badly. And so what's so interesting about this song is it does talk about the sadness of war, all the people dying, but it's very respectful to the soldiers, which would probably not have been very popular at the time when this song came out. This was one of their earlier songs, so it came out, I did not write down the year here when it came out. I believe it was probably around 68, 69, 70, early in their careers, because it was during the Vietnam War, and it couldn't come out much later than that because the Vietnam War ended in the 1970s. So it was not very popular to honor the soldiers. It should have been popular. We should always do that. Like I said, they didn't want to fight, a lot of them. So it was not their fault. You should blame the politicians if you don't like that war. Don't blame the soldiers. It's just like, for example, another unpopular war we had in America was when we went into Iraq in 2003. Most Americans didn't think that was right. And a lot of the soldiers, now they were volunteers. We didn't have a draft then, but they volunteered because they wanted to go fight in Afghanistan because that's where we were attacked from on 9/11/2001. So again, you have these soldiers who were going off to fight this war that they had no They didn't want to fight. Now, thankfully, I think we kind of learned our lesson from the Vietnam War. So when those soldiers came back, they were not treated quite as badly. They were treated as they should be treated. So we kind of learned our lesson after the Vietnam War. But again, so this song is anti-war song, but it's actually very sympathetic toward the soldiers. Okay? And it's actually, even in a way, it's in a weird way, it's almost pro-war if the war is worth fighting for. You'll see what I mean by the end part, the cost of freedom part that comes at the end. That's that section I told you before was added on. All right, so let's go ahead and get to those lyrics. So first of all, let's listen to the song. All right, so we're going to listen to the song now. Any of you joining us on YouTube, as you know, if you've watched this program before, because of copyright issues, we cannot play the video we cannot embed the video here. So we're going to give you a link to the video on the upper right-hand side. Click on the link, watch the video, and then come back and listen to the rest of our program. For those of you just listening, you should have no problem. The beginning of the video, which if you're just listening on radio, all you'll hear is the audio of it. But the beginning of the video, it starts out a little slowly because they're actually tuning their guitars. So just be patient. Give it a minute. The video is not that long because it's not a very long song. So even with their tuning of their guitars, it's only about a 4-minute video. It takes them about a minute to get going. And then it's about a 3-minute song. So just be patient at the beginning. You'll hear them tuning up their guitars. All right, so let's get to the song.
Musical musings, musical musings, musical musings, musical musings.
All right, welcome back. So that was Daylight again, along with The Cost of Freedom, which again, that second part, that was right at the end. That was that last verse you heard. I'm not really sure if it goes with this song because it sounds like it fits naturally in. But they also put this in one of their other songs sometimes. Sometimes you'll hear them do that, do Cost of Freedom with the song Ohio, which is another song about war and peace. So again, this is an anti-war song, which is actually quite respectful towards the soldiers. Which, like I said, I mean, it's the way we all should be, right? The soldiers, it's not their choice to fight the war. That's the politicians. But honestly, when this song was written, that was not the case. So this is quite an interesting song. It's very interesting the way they wrote this song. And I think because, like I said, we learned our lesson in Vietnam about treating our soldiers better. I think this song really holds up, and it's still a really good song today. Okay, so let's go through these lyrics. And right away, we start with one of these interesting couple of lines where it's a little difficult to interpret. I tell you this with a lot of songs, that it's not like the singer goes through and explains every line of his song to you. So sometimes these words are hard to understand what he means. It says, daylight again, following me to bed. What does he mean by that? A little hard to say. But I think what he is saying there, it's daylight, he's trying to go to bed. I think he's having trouble sleeping because he's got thoughts in his head. And in fact, the next couple of lines do talk about him thinking about stuff. So then the next two lines are, I think about 100 years ago, how my father bled. Okay, so this one might not be obvious to you. What are we talking about here? 100 years ago, how my father's bled? What does that mean? Okay, well, you have to Remember, this is an American group. Actually, a couple of them I think are from Britain, but basically this is an American group. Neil Young wrote the song. He's an American. Crosby, he's the first name on the list here. I believe he's American. Actually, I may not be right about that. I'd have to look that up. So 100 years ago, again, remember this song was written like late 1960s. So 100 years ago would be the 1860s. That is the Civil War going on in America. So that's what he's talking about there. I think about 100 years ago, how my fathers bled. So 100 years ago, that's obviously not his father. His father wouldn't have been alive 100 years ago. It means fathers kind of in a more general term, like maybe his grandfather, his great-grandfather, his uncles, other people, other family loved ones who were older, who were men at the time. That's what he's talking about when he says fathers. How my fathers bled. So that's what he's thinking about here. He's thinking about the Civil War. And that becomes important in the next verse. These verses are really short, so that's the first verse. The next verse, the whole idea that we're talking about the Civil War becomes very important. It says, I think I see a valley covered with bones in blue. Okay, so covered with bones in blue. What in the world does that mean? Why would they be blue? All right, so what he's talking about here is really a bunch of dead soldiers. So they're in a valley. He sees a valley covered with bones in blue. So why would they be blue? The answer to that is actually very simple. They're blue because that was the color of the uniforms of the Northern soldiers. So Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, because of kind of their political beliefs, they're definitely going to take the side of the Northern soldiers in the American Civil War. The Northern soldiers were fighting to end slavery. The Southern soldiers were fighting to keep it. So that's why they're mostly paying their respects here to the Northern soldiers. They don't say anything bad about the Southern soldiers. And again, people were forced to fight, so you shouldn't. The Southern soldiers, what they were fighting for wasn't good, but it's not necessarily the soldiers' fault. They might have been forced to fight. But we're mostly going to be talking about the Northern soldiers here. So that's why it says covered with bones in blue. It's the soldiers wearing blue. It's the Northern soldiers. We call them in America, we call them the Union because they were trying to keep the country together. Okay, the next couple lines. All the brave soldiers that cannot get older been asking after you. All right, I sang that a little too low. So what does that mean? Okay, all the brave soldiers. So again, giving them respect, calling them brave. So this was not something we normally did around this time in America. All the brave soldiers that cannot get older. What does that mean? Cannot get older. They're dead. We're talking about the dead soldiers again. So it's so this is a kind of this is an anti-war song. That's why it's focusing on all the death that happens and how it's just not worth it. So all the brave soldiers who cannot get older because they died. And it says, been asking after you. That is a saying in English which doesn't really make sense from the words. Been asking after you. What does that mean? Doesn't mean what it sounds like. Well, all it simply means when you say that someone's been asking after you, it means they're asking how you're doing. So in other words, what this is saying is these soldiers, obviously they're not really asking, they're dead. He's probably imagining this because he says, I think I see a valley. So he's this is his imagination. What he would imagine they would be saying to us is basically, how are you doing? They gave their lives for this. They gave their lives for this, to end slavery in America. So They've been asking after you. In other words, they're asking, how's it going? What's happened? And at this same time in America, there was also a lot of racial tension. So this is kind of a negative song here because it wasn't going so well when this song was written. It was starting to get better, but it wasn't great. It was not going so well. We didn't, obviously, slavery was gone because the Union won this war. So slavery was gone after this war. But there was still a lot of racial tension in America. All right. So then we get to the next verse. I hear the pastor calling from Armageddon's side. When everyone's talking and no one is listening, how can we decide? All right. So what does all this mean? I hear the past calling from Armageddon's side. Okay. Armageddon. That is a phrase that a lot of people in Christian believing countries are familiar with. It basically is the way to describe the end of the world from the Bible. So, and the Bible talks about there would be a lot of wars. So this is why he says he hears the past calling from Armageddon's side. In other words, the Civil War, which is what he was just talking about, it was like the end of the world. So many people in America died during the Civil War. It's the bloodiest war ever for America. America's been around almost exactly 250 years. That was the worst war. Vietnam was probably the second worst. I believe the U.S. lost probably far more people in World War II, but that was viewed as a justifiable war because of what we were fighting in World War II. Vietnam War, everyone thought was just a waste. So the Vietnam War was just, I mean, it was viewed very negatively. So that's why he's talking about, he hears the past calling, like from the Civil War, which was like Armageddon, the end of the world. So he hears the past calling from Armageddon's side. When everyone's talking and no one's listening, how can we decide? All right. We had a similar line in one of the other songs we did. You can listen as well as you hear, came from another song we did. This is kind of saying the same thing. And you can think about this, especially with politicians. They're always talking, but nobody ever changes their mind, right? Or hardly ever. Few people do. But almost nobody ever changes their mind. Talk, 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 talk. Nobody's listening. Nobody's actually listening to anyone else, hearing their arguments. I mean, you still might not change your mind because you might disagree with their arguments, but at least listen. So that's what this is about. Everyone's fighting. We're not getting anywhere. Everyone's talking. No one's listening. So how can we decide? Okay, and that's really actually the end of the main song. We then just get this one extra verse with the cost of freedom. So it goes, do we find the cost of freedom buried in the ground? Mother Earth will swallow you. Lay your body down. All right, so this might be a little hard to understand because of some of the words they use, but actually it's pretty straightforward. Do we find the cost of freedom buried in the ground? So again, we're talking about the soldiers being dead. They're buried. That is the cost of freedom. And again, we're mostly talking about the Civil War here again. Their anti-war stance is about the Vietnam War, but they're talking about the Civil War because that was to gain people's freedom. So that's the cost of freedom. And that's why I say it's almost like a pro-war song if the war is worthwhile. It's still sad because they're talking about a valley covered with bones and blue. It's still really sad. All these soldiers died. But this is what it took to get freedom for a whole group of people. So do we find the cost of freedom buried in the ground? Mother Earth will swallow you. In other words, you're being buried. Lay your body down. So again, it's a really sad song about all the soldiers dying in war, but it's actually, like I said, very different song from the time because it's actually very respectful to the soldiers. It's very sad, calls them brave soldiers. It's really mourning their loss here in this song. So I really like this song. I think it's a great song. But I will tell you that CSNY, They have so many great songs. I always tell people when we do this program that you should listen to other songs by these groups that we do. This is one of the times where you definitely should. They have so many great songs. Teach Your Children, I mentioned that one earlier. Helpless is another good one. Our House, Long Time Gone, Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, Southern Cross, Ohio, Guinevere, lots more. I think Southern Cross might be, and Ohio are two of my other favorites by them. Teach Your Children is also a really good song, but they've got tons of great songs. You could listen to them for hours. All right. So before we close, one thing I didn't mention in part one, which I usually talk about, is kind of what style they sing. You heard this song; it was kind of almost folk style, like acoustic guitars and singing without a whole lot of other instruments there. A lot of their songs are like that. I would call them a folk band, but definitely some of their songs get a little bit more like soft rock or um, even a little bit more like pop music, a little bit here or there, but mostly they are in that folk genre. Some of them, like I said, do get a little bit more like rock. So you could maybe call them folk rock. Like Southern Cross is a little bit more folk rock. It's not heavy rock, but it's a little bit more rock and roll style. So they do cross genres as most bands do, but mostly CSNY is a folk band. All right. Thank you for joining us for today's Musical Musings program. Please stay with us and tune back in next week when I will bring you another great song. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.
Musical musings, musical musings, musical